So we're going to talk about criminal law and why it's an important addition to the toolbox that we have when it comes to using laws to create incentives for the sort of behavior that we want and avoiding the sort of behavior that we don't want. This comes into most stark contrast in criminal law, because here we're talking about a lot of behaviors that we really don't want, right? People murdering stuff, murdering people, people stealing things, people saying horrendous stuff that can cause damage to others. These are things that we have created criminal laws to prevent. And generally, we think of criminal law as being distinct from tort or property or contract law, and that these are behaviors that have huge spillovers. The class of victims is actually really wide. And by that, I mean a crime has more than just the direct victim of the crime. So if there's a murder, obviously there's a victim of the murder, the person who was killed. They were obviously harmed in a huge way. Their family is affected in a huge way. That's absolutely true. It's also true that everyone in that area, maybe even in the whole country, feels less safe now because that murder happened, right? So everyone is harmed by that murder, not just the person who was killed and their family. Criminal law is for these acts that have huge spillovers, huge negative externalities, we call them, where everyone feels less safe because these things are happening, whether that's stealing stuff from someone's backyard or driving drunk in a car or murdering someone. Another reason we use criminal law is something like, someone who's been killed. You can talk about a wrongful death tort where the person who caused that death to occur could have to pay compensation to the family of the deceased. But we all know that that is not adequate compensation, right? Criminal law is really about trying to say, these are things we don't want to happen. We're going to attach really stiff penalties to them. That could be monetary fines, but very often we're thinking about jail and prison, right? So we're thinking about taking someone's liberty away because they've done something so bad we as a society have said, we really want to deter it in the first place. We know that compensation is not going to be adequate, so we're going to attach big penalties that try to prevent it from happening in the beginning. So when it comes to criminal law, law and econ is all about thinking about this deterrent aspect of the laws. How much can we avoid having these horrible things happening? Now, a few primers on criminal law. It's important to think about mens rea, the mental state that someone is in when they're engaging in activities. Criminal law requires more than what we saw in torts. So in torts, we saw we saw a lot of negligence, right? Someone wasn't engaging in as much precaution as they should have. They didn't meet the standard of care, what a reasonable person would do. For criminal law, we need more than that. We're not talking about people being careless, we're talking about people who are being at least reckless, which we actually saw in tort when we talked about punitive damages. That's when people know that there's a substantial risk and they ignore it. They do the dangerous activity anyway. Very often with criminal law, beyond recklessness, we're talking about willful behavior, knowing behavior. You engage in an activity knowing that someone is going to, or at least very likely to be killed from it. Or maybe you are meaning to do it, right? You're trying to lead to this bad outcome. Murder is when someone it's not just that they are reckless and someone dies, or that they engage in some activity knowing that there's a chance someone dies. They're trying to kill someone, right? So that is a level of intent, a level of mental state that is much higher than just being careless. It's about you are either doing something on purpose that is bad, or you know that there's a substantial risk of bad things happening and you're doing it anyway. That's kind of the minimum mental state for criminal law, recklessness. Now, mens rea attaches to each of the elements in a crime, which is something we haven't seen before. So what you see on TV shows is not usually accurate when it comes to how criminal law is actually set up. So in TV shows, you usually hear about, what do the police need to find? Well, they need to find the body. They need to find the weapon. You hear a lot about alibis. So it makes it seem like if there's a body and a weapon and a motive and no good alibi, then you've got it. You've got someone, you've proved that they murdered someone, right? That's the general impression you would get from these shows. That's not actually what has to be shown in court. In court, you need to show that acts happened and that there was a mental state attached to each of those. So if we're talking about murder in most states, it is intentional killing of another. So you have to show that someone engaged in an act that caused the death of someone else, that they meant to do that, and you need to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. So that's the burden of proof when it comes to criminal law, which is much higher than the preponderance of evidence standard that we saw in tort, contract, property. The only exception when, again, we were talking about punitive damages in tort, many states have a clear and convincing standard, which is somewhere in between preponderance and beyond a reasonable doubt. Beyond a reasonable doubt doesn't mean no doubt. It just means that the government has shown that these elements were met with the required mental state beyond a reasonable doubt. So that's kind of the core of how our criminal system is set up. We've got a rule that criminal law has to be laid out in statutes. You don't just get criminal law from the common law. We want the legislature to have spelled out what a crime is and what elements it has. And of course, there's case law that fills in a lot of details that are left unsaid. But the criminal law, people need to be on notice what is a crime, right? And so we require that criminal laws be written down in statutes or regulations that have been authorized through statutes. And the government carries a heavy burden when it brings a criminal case. A reason we do that, well, we're talking about, again, very often taking away someone's liberty by throwing them in prison. We don't do that lightly. Another factor is the government is big, right? It has a lot of resources. So we don't want this Goliath of a government coming down on the little guys without having protections for the little guys. And so there's a lot of rights that criminal defendants have. And the Supreme Court weighs in on this quite regularly because there's this constant tension between, well, how do we make sure we are punishing and getting the proper levels of deterrence by having a criminal law that actually functions, while at the same time making sure the government isn't abusing its powers in different ways, coming against these, I'm going to say little guys, in the sense that criminal defendants are very often individuals, very often they're young, very often they're from low socioeconomic status. It would be really easy for these people to be marginalized by the big government, and that's why our law affords a lot of protections to try to make sure they don't get railroaded in this whole process with a Kafkaesque sort of trial and such. So that's an overview of how our criminal system is set up. With one more detail, I clerked for federal judges. In federal court, they have quite a few criminal cases, especially drug cases, gun possession cases, some criminal sexual misconduct cases. But the federal crimes are all things that are within the federal jurisdiction, meaning there's some hook for federal authority. So that is often interstate commerce, so it relies on the Commerce Clause of the Constitution to give federal authority in that area. But generally speaking, most criminal law stuff is happening in state courts. So states have a general police power, so this fits squarely within the mandate of state governments to protect the general welfare of the public, right? And so murder and domestic abuse and speeding and drunk driving, a lot of the things we commonly think of as criminal law are happening in the state courts. And so we have these two parallel systems. Sometimes we see a case that's going forward in both systems. You get some of the mass shooting examples. Someone is violating both federal law and state law, and they're charged under both. And it happens sometimes. There was talk of that with some of the Roger Stone sort of issues. But generally speaking, a lot of stuff is squarely just within the state courts when it comes to criminal law. And that means there's a lot of variation across states. And often in a law school, you'll talk about the model penal code, which is kind of this, well, it's a model of what a criminal law set of statutes should look like, at least as a lot of criminal law experts see it. But what states actually have often differs from that in pretty substantial ways. So that can end up mattering in practice. We don't get into the details of that here, but it's good to know a little bit of context about what we're talking about.